Hello, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
I guess we could get started. Am I still the only thing on the yeah, I'm the only thing on the agenda today. So I wanted to chat a little bit about redis. So I've got a cluster stood up in both virtual machine land as well as inside of Kubernetes. What's inside of Kubernetes is kind of a test Redis cluster that I stood up because I can't figure out how to make tonka work with a custom built chart that is not a packaged chart, but is instead a repository that contains all the configurations. If there's a way to do that, I would love to talk to someone about that. But in the meantime, I'm just like, here, I have helm chart. Let's just run a helm command because that at least gets me what I want without tonka being in the way, which I think for the purposes of testing and getting us to the point where we could start wiring things up and testing further, I think that's more beneficial at this moment in time. If we all disagree, I would love to chat more. But I wanted to share my screen and showcase what I've got going on. Is the font size suitable for everyone? I'll make it a little bigger. Okay, so we have over here in this panel, I've got the FQDNs for our virtual machines, and I just did a kgit pods with the name and the IP address. So we have our cluster inside of Kubernetes, and we've got our virtual machines. The IP addresses are listed as such. In this panel, I'm connected to what thinks.
And Skarbek, one question. Sorry for interrupting. This Kubernetes cluster, where is that running? Is that running in pre?
It's on pre-prod and it's inside of a namespace called Skarbek.
Okay, so you just did like a Helm apply in your Skarbek namespace.
Precisely. You know,
cool. Thanks.
I shouldn't be because, you know, it's pre-prod and we do run stuff in pre-prod, but I thought, hey, you know, let's test. So I am connected to node 3, who for some reason thinks he's primary, which I don't think is correct. Let me do a refresh on the Sentinel Masters command because the current primary is going to be 6.157, which is technically a Redis, which is a pod, a Redis node 1. But we see at the bottom here that we have 6 secondary Redis nodes and that we've got 5 other sentinels, which is precisely what we want to see, I think, because this kind of confirms that Redis and Sentinel are able to talk to each other. And this is kind of where Igor, I kind of need your guidance on kind of further validation to make sure all of this is working as desired and making sure that things work correctly. Because I don't know how to validate whether or not a secondary node is up to speed with the primary node. And I also don't know how to query anything. Over here in this window, I'm connected to the redis. This is the sentinel rather. A pod. I connected to a redis node 1, the one that was supposed to be noted as the primary. And if we do a replicas, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we have all 6 sentinels available, and you can see the IP addresses are noted here. So 16.251 is our pod. 232.4.102 is going to be one of our nodes. So that's node 2. And then we've got, see, this is the strange thing here is I see sometimes we see the FQDN and sometimes we see the IP address, but here is pod 0. And here's the IP address for node 3.
That's a VM, yeah.
Yep. And then here's the FQDN for the second pod. And then the 4101
That's a VM.
is the IP address of a virtual machine. So that's the one thing I find odd is that we're getting a mixture of FQDNs and IP addresses. So I'm not really sure what to do with that or if that's going to be a problem.
I think that's because we announce for the pods, we're overriding the announced IP to be the external DNS entry, right?
Yes.
And for the VMs, we're not doing any of that. So it just uses the IP address.
Okay, so then I guess explain to me why pod 0 is showing up with its IP address instead of its FQDN.
That
It's
is a
the only
very
one
good
that does that,
question.
right? So that might
Yes.
be something to do with the way that I join these clusters together.
Could be.
I don't know how to accomplish that in the right way. So I followed the guidance from what I saw with what we did when we stand up new clusters. So after I had both of these clusters running, they're running independent of each other. And I basically logged into a virtual machine and said, hey, be a replica of a Redis node 0 using that FQDN.
Mm-hmm.
So all the virtual machines were told to be replicas of one of our pods. And it turns out the one that was actually primary at the time I read this was the first pod, not pod 0, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So I never ran any commands on the actual pods themselves.
And when you said, maybe when you ran the replica of command, or like when you configured this to be a replica, did you use the external DNS for that, or did you put the IP?
The FQDN, yeah.
That's weird. Okay. Yeah, so that sounds like something we need to investigate.
To look at.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in the meantime, I thought maybe, Igor, if you could help me, like, what's a good way to test that things are kind of working? Like, I don't even know. I'm not familiar enough with Redis to be able to like, oh, let's set a key and make sure we can read it from a secondary in some other virtual machine or some other pod, for example.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing that I would try is running the roll command on each instance. And that'll tell us not only whether it considers itself a primary, but also if it's a replica, who is it a replica of? And what is the replication offset? So this is a primary.
This is the primary, and this is
and it's listing its replicas.
Pod 1. So I guess over here, let me connect to just redis. Role. So
There
it
we go.
thinks it's a secondary.
And it's connected to 157.
157, which is the person who thinks it's a master.
Yeah. So that looks reasonable. And then the replication offset, we can probably compare that with what the primary is saying. And are there any clients talking to any of these redises at all?
No.
Okay.
Only my CLIs here.
So it's a bit weird to see a difference in that replication offset, but actually when we've asked the master, it sees the same replication offset. No, one of them is off, right?
What are you looking at for this offset?
It's that number that starts with 257 on the top left panel. We've got first right under master. It's got kind of what the master thinks its replication offset is.
Yeah.
And then for each of the replicas, we've got how up to date is this replica?
Yeah.
And so one of those looks like it's kind of behind, right?
Yeah, like everything says it's 257, ends in 3096. This one up
Right.
here is significantly different.
Right.
But like all of them are the same except whoever
Yes.
this one is. Who is 16251?
What is that number?
That is node 0.
That is node 0.
Replication offset. I don't know
Like
exactly
a timestamp sort of type thing.
something along those lines.
Okay.
I think it might be like a transaction counter, something like that.
So I wonder if we force a failover, what would happen, because the cluster is technically in an interesting state right now. So
right.
So let's do an example failover. It might take
Sure.
over a minute because I didn't change that one configuration item for my test cluster.
Yeah.
So
well, I think if we force a failover, it should happen immediately. It's only if we take a node out and the health checks fail, that's where that setting will wait for up to a minute by default and up to, or at least a minute or at least 10 seconds when we modify it. But if we say sentinel failover, then it'll go ahead and do the failover. And you need to say, I think you need to also say the master set or the replica set. So my master or whatever you called it in this case. Yeah, that should work. Okay.
Interesting.
It's the master, but all of the replicas have left.
Yeah, but he thinks he's the master as well, and he's got 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah. So all of the clients are reconnecting to this one now. And Sentinel, if you go back to the top left and ask again, it's probably gonna.
Oh.
Yeah, try again.
Okay.
Try again. And it's probably gonna say now, yes. So now it's stepped down.
And it's connected to 4.103. And who's 4.103? That's
it's a VM.
3. And we've got 2, 1, 4102 and 16. Yeah, so this one's still showing it's interesting.
Right.
But like that might be an artifact of the way I join these clusters together. So there's probably a better procedure I need to follow for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. What's another good quick test that we could do for demo time?
We could try getting a non-existing key on a replica, then setting that key on the primary, and then getting it on the replica.
Okay, so how do we get a key?
Get space key name. So get foo. Okay.
Nil. And if we, I guess it's going to be set key.
Yeah. Set foo. Just set foo.
Does it need to be equal to any, or I guess space?
No, just a value. Just a value. Yeah. Space.
Bar.
Yeah.
So get foo.
Yeah.
Get foo.
Beautiful.
That worked. So one thing I question though is when I look at these roles, this value is still different across like nearly everything.
I mean, I guess that may also be updating async. What happens if you rerun roll now? Do we still get the same?
Looks like it's always incrementing. So it's more different now than it was a second ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you know what causes this value to increment? Is
I
it just
don't know.
time? Okay.
Yeah, I was under the impression that it's actual mutations. And I do know that the sentinels use redis for coordination as well. So this could actually be the sentinels that are, having a chat.
Yeah.
And that is driving this number to go up.
Okay.
But I don't know that for a fact.
Cool.
Yeah, but I think this is good enough for a first demo. This is really cool.
I guess I should go into a little bit of the detail as to how I set this up. Because I
Yes,
haven't
please.
really discussed that at all. So let me share with you. Let's see, what's the best way to showcase this? Maybe I'll just talk about it. I'll just talk about it. If we have questions about what changes I made to the Helm chart, we can dive into my pull request. I'm currently leveraging the external DNS project to accomplish this goal. We use this already for Prometheus and the alert managers. And this is just me tagging on to the Bitnami Helm chart to add certain capabilities to make external DNS more friendly and more configurable. Because right now, we suffer a problem where if we have no Helm chart changes at all, we get the appropriate DNS entries, but what we don't get from Redis itself is the appropriate advertisement for which IP address or which FQDN we want to connect to. By default, the Helm chart defaults to announcing either the headless service, depending on how you have Redis configured, or it's going to advertise the Sentinel service name. No, it's either, excuse me, it's either going to be the headless service or it's going to be the pods FQDN that's internal to the cluster. That is, either of those options is not beneficial to us because no node outside of the cluster is going to understand how to connect to either of those fully qualified domain names at all. So what I've created,
because we want to talk to Redis from outside of Kubernetes, from some
precisely,
of our VMs.
like there's no way for us to say, hey, Redis node 1, like the physical virtual machine, in order to resolve this internal only DNS name, go talk to this Kubernetes cluster in some way, shape, or form. Like, I don't know how we would accomplish that today. And that's going to be even worse when it comes to clients having to do the same thing because they're going to live in different clusters and they're going to have different clusters to talk to. And I don't know how to resolve that problem. So external DNS seemed like a suitable solution. So to configure this, you need a few things. One is just a simple annotation. Well, one, you need the extraneous project usable and configured, and it works. And for us, we already use it, so perfect. We already got that checked off. We need a annotation added to the headless service of the Redis help chart, which we could do out of the box. It's just not the cleanest way to accomplish it. So my PR makes that a little bit easier. But we also need to make a change to the way Redis gets configured when it stands itself up. There's a set of bash scripts that are inside of this Helm chart that are stored as configuration maps that get called upon when Redis starts. These are responsible for setting up the announce IP addresses or announce FQDNs. And there's a little bit of logic as to how that bash script determines which IP address or which FQDN to advertise. So my pull request adds on to that logic to leverage the extra DNS entries that we've created. So the pull request itself is not very large. It's just whether or not Bitnami is willing to accept this pull request and whether or not this is going to be a usable solution. I kind of think it is, but I would love further input from other people that are sitting here on this call to look at that pull request. I guess I'll link it into the agenda for other people to look at. I'll put it on the discussion item. So it's logically, it's not a very large pull request. It's just mainly just making things a little bit easier. And I think at this point, now that I've got a working cluster, it's just a matter of learning what the failure scenarios are and learning what we need to accomplish to recover from certain failure scenarios during a migration when we might have both of these stood up at the same time. So that's kind of the next steps that I'll be looking into. So the project is moving, from my perspective, it's moving a little sluggish just because I'm not very familiar with Redis and all the various things. And, connecting to Redis is also not the easiest thing in the world because of authentication. So I may disable authentication for testing temporarily, but we'll see how it goes. So yeah, that's where I stand. So questions?
Just want to say again, this looks really great and looks like a very promising step for our migration, which is one of the pieces that I have been worrying about quite a bit in the back of my head.
I still am.
Yeah. But it's looking good so far.
I think logistically, no matter what our end solution is, if we're able to pull off a clean migration where we have both clusters, or excuse me, both infrastructures running together with Redis, and we transition to Kubernetes and turn on virtual machines, it's probably blog post worthy. Like, this is an interesting problem to solve.
Probably. This could be conference talk worthy. Scaleback.
Probably KubeCon material.
Well, don't sit here trying to put me on stage again.
We can get Marin to do
it. We'll write a proposal, Scaleback, but you'll probably do the talk.
Let's get it done first, obviously. But one of the other solutions I had spoken about in our last demo meeting was the use of console. And just to kind of catch everyone up to speed with what testing I did over what everyone else took as a break, but I was still working. I was trying to get console to work and I couldn't figure out why, but I could get it to work inside of Minikube. But as soon as I tried to take the exact same implementation inside of our pre-cluster, I could not get it to work. Like, console would just not do its job, and I could not understand why. Philip got back to me and said, hey, there's another option inside a console that we could leverage that it just operates differently. So I may check that out again in the future. But at the moment, I'm kind of set on seeing if we could get this external IP or external DNS project moving, because I enjoy how that's turning out so far. I don't want to completely dismiss console because we already utilize it anyways. So this might be a good use case for expanding our use of console, but at the same time, it's kind of hard for me to recommend it because we don't treat console very well, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's a good back pocket option. We talked about this, Garvik, so yeah.
Yeah, like I think it's worth looking into just in case this external DNS kind of falls apart. So I think at this point, what I would like to do is continue my testing with this, 2 clusters linked together kind of situation. I also need to learn redis to, just to figure out what kind of failure scenarios I'm going to run into. So I think I might have a bunch of questions for Igor and Sean over the course of time as I look into this further. And I'm going to keep an eye on my pull request that I've got opened. If you all have feedback, please try to provide it. That way I could try to get ahead of the maintainers reviewing it as well. Because I only targeted, my pull request only targets what I needed specifically, and I may need to do some work on stuff that's unrelated to Sentinel, for example. So I need to make sure I get ahead of that kind of thing. And then if I get some free time, I'll look at console.
And it could be worth asking Jason if he has any feedback on that pull request as well.
I'll do that. That's a good idea.
Can I ask a question about the using this Bitnami chart? So you mentioned that it looks like it's only going to work if it's packaged. Was that correct? Did I understand that?
So we're using Tonka for our ability to deploy Helm charts. I don't know, or I cannot figure out how to tell Tonka to be like, hey, I have a Helm chart. It's not packaged, but you could find it in this repository. I don't know how to do that. Helm allows us to do this because you could specify in Helm, say, hey, just use this directory where I've got the Helm chart set up, and it'll do its job like it's supposed to. I don't know if Tonka has a similar functionality. So like if this pull request does get accepted, we would have to wait for Bitnami to perform a release.
Yeah, I would suggest maybe joining the Grafana Slack. I think there is a Grafana one. Yes, Grafana Labs community Slack. And there's a Tonka channel there, and ask them, and just ask if this is something that Tonka supports. And if not, whether you should open an issue about it, because it seems like a reasonable feature to have.
I agree. One of the other items I was looking into yesterday prior to getting this workable was trying to use the existing Helm chart as is, but then we insert some custom items. So like the config map that contains these bash scripts is kind of large, which is kind of a bummer. But if we could figure out a way to, customize that in a way that works for us, and then we could wait for the upstream to accept our pull request as necessary. And then we could revert back to using the native Helm chart when they perform a release. The problem I ran into that is I couldn't figure out a way to get Tonka again to make the changes necessary. And this could just be my very limited knowledge of Tonka / JSON it. So we have options at the moment. We just need to keep testing.
Awesome. Sounds good. So do we have a rough plan for what we want to achieve in the next week?
My rough plan is to test the linking of these 2 clusters together. I might redo it to see if I can figure out a better procedure to make sure that we get our desired FQDN / IPs showing up in Redis. And also test failovers, node loss, pod destructions, that kind of thing. Just to figure out what kind of situations we may run into, because, although this is just Redis, we do have two significantly different infrastructures running these things. I want to make sure that Redis is going to be a stable system with this type of deployment. That way, when we do a procedure to replace these Redis nodes, we're not running into a situation that we don't know how to handle. So it's going to be learning failure scenarios, testing those failure scenarios, and testing recovery, etc. Which, you know, I don't know everything to test, so I'm going to have to figure that out. I'll learn along the way. This is a learning experience.
Definitely is.
For all of us.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Skarbek, what are your thoughts, or others on the call as well? What are your thoughts on automating a bit more of this setup? Maybe maybe repurposing actually some of the sandbox code to spin up in a dedicated GCP project a set of VMs, a GKE cluster, a Redis in that cluster, and then we can sort of have a repeatable test case for this setup. And I think it would also pay off in being able to tweak something and rerun the whole thing and see, like, you know, iterating towards getting FQDNs to show up and not IP addresses. There may be a lot of manual steps to repeat if you want to like manually rejoin the cluster every time. So what are your thoughts on investing in automation for that now?
I'm not opposed to it.
Yeah, I think it
think-
would be a good one if you like maybe time box it for a bit and see. But yeah, I think if it's a repeatable step that we're going to do like a number of times, and it could well be worth it.
I agree. I think my holdup is just I'm also learning Redis as a whole. So I kind of want to focus my efforts on learning that first. But if Igor, if that interests you, I would totally encourage it.
I think there's already quite a bit of stuff there in that sandbox repo. We already have some Redis VMs managed via Terraform. We have GKE. We have some basic helming going on. So I think we're already kind of 80% of the way there.
Can you
So-
link in the
Yes,
agenda, the
yeah,
sandbox project, and
will do.
also the Slack channel that I should check out? Because that would be beneficial deep into the future as well.
Yeah, it sounds good. I think, do you want to maybe spend like 2 or 3 days, Igor, and just see like, does it look like we have enough of the pieces and it's going to, you know, unblock us as much as we expect, and then, you know, at least we'll have a bit of a POC or something.
Yeah, I'll try and focus on that this week.
Awesome. So could someone just kind of give me like a broad overview of where we are in terms of this rate limiting migration? Like, what are the sort of broad pieces that we know we have in place, and what we maybe know that we still need to kind of figure out for this one?
So I'm kind of going back to the epic for this, and I think there's a few parallel threads going on. The main one that Skarbek is working on, and I guess is kind of our current collective focus right now, is the migration path. One big question mark for me as well is observability and CPU profiling, getting that working in GKE. I want to maybe work with Matt Smiley on that from the scalability side, if possible. Another big part that is ongoing is kind of talking to Redis from outside of Kubernetes. So those are, I'd say those two, that one and migration, are kind of the main ones that are in progress right now. And then stuff that still needs to be done, observability, deep diving into some of the strange behaviors that we saw and really understanding some of those things better. Testing, a lot of testing. That's kind of the big themes that I think we still need to work on.
Cool. Okay, makes sense.
Does that seem reasonable? Is there anything big that I missed? I guess well, kind of following out of that testing, also coming up with procedures for how to actually do these operations in production. Like, how do we recover? How do we restore data from a backup? That kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Okay.
And then we still got other things that, it's going to be a while before we get to this state, but we want to make sure that the Redis cluster inside of Kubernetes is configured as much as possible the same as the virtual machines. I certainly have not concentrated any effort on doing that, but I know that we'll probably going to run into, there's probably some configuration that we set our virtual machines that we can't carry over to our Kubernetes clusters because of maybe a limitation of the Helm chart. So at some point, we need to kind of audit the configurations to make sure that we get what we get out of it as well.
Yeah,
that's already been kind of done.
Okay.
So we're I think already pretty close. But yes, we should review that before we go live.
When we are talking about testing things and what is to be done still, do we plan to do a readiness review before we bring this into place?
Yes.
Okay.
We must do a readiness review. And
yes.
Because
maybe
some things of those
for...
testings and yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say maybe it might be a good idea is like to go ahead, get a readiness review started, and then we kind of just log like our steps and procedures of what we tested and the results of those tests as just part of the readiness review. I'm not sure.
Yeah, because we often tend to prepare things by learning how to do things, then we implement them, and then we write the readiness review, right? And maybe if we learned enough to understand what we need to do, maybe already starting parallel with readiness review, bring in points over that we learned, and especially as Igor mentioned, things like testing to restore from a backup and things like that would be good to have already noted somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, a lot of the readiness review can link to things that we've done. So
yeah, not a lot of write-up, but just linking to the things. Yeah.
Link to our performance tests. We've already done extensive performance testing. So yeah, ideally, the readiness review will refer to existing material.
Yeah,
I agree.
I mean, we have this structured like this already for our readiness reviews. We just have the topics that we want to mention and review, right? And the idea is to just link then from there to the results we have noted somewhere else. And but this gives us some kind of structure if we have tested for durability, security, performance, and all of these concerns, right? And starting with that from the beginning maybe brings us to things that we forgot to think about. So I guess starting with that makes sense in parallel.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess a lot of the roadmap that has been laid out so far covers a lot of the stuff that will come up in the readiness review. But I think it does make sense to kind of go through the readiness review template, see what is missing, what have we not yet addressed or not yet planned to address, and then just generate a whole bunch of issues out of that. I can take that as a task.
Awesome. Thanks, Igor. Brilliant. Is there any more stuff that people want to discuss today? No? Okay. I just want to add a comment though that Skarbet, you mentioned that this has been a bit sluggish for the last few weeks. Just want to say, like, holidays and this is fine, right? Like, I think as long as we're making progress and we feel like we are focusing on the most important stuff, figuring these things out is super valuable. And, you know, like, we can't go faster than we can go. So as long as we stay focused on what matters, then it takes as much time as it takes, right? Like, I'm definitely at the stage where I want to revise our OKR, because we currently have on there to do rate limiting and one of the other, I can't remember which one of the other Redis clusters. We're definitely not going to do 2, right? But that's okay, because what we've learned in this time about how to do the migration, how to set up the charts, how to do deployment, like, it's going to help us in all the future ones. So it's not a problem. So don't worry about like us having to get things wrapped up straight away. Let's just keep progressing and set ourselves up for a successful migration. Awesome. Thank you so much for the demo and discussion. It was a super great way for me to start my year. I feel like I'm at least up to speed on this one project, so that's great. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.